Good evening, everyone. My name is Jamie Wilkins. I'm Project Officer at Worcestershire Archaeology, and I had the privilege of leading the excavations at Milestone Ground over the last 14 months or so. I say privilege, it certainly was a privilege, but I feel a lot older now than when I started back in June 2024. A little bit of background about myself. I've worked for Worcestershire Archaeology since 2015, and specifically I worked as an archaeologist, helped excavate the flood alleviation site, which I believe my colleague Robin came to speak to you about earlier this year. And I also wrote the report for that site. So I have done a little bit on the archaeology of Broadway over the years. Usually, I would go into the background and give a site location, but I think everyone here knows where Milestone Ground is and have probably seen us working away on it over the last year or so. But I will just briefly touch on the background to the landscape around Broadway. And what you see on this slide in front of you, in red, highlighted in red, are the crop marks, or the known crop marks from around Broadway itself. And what this tells us, and what we've known from other works, is that this landscape is incredibly rich in archaeology, and our Milestone Ground site showed up really well as crop marks, and you can see that really dense area in the centre of this image. That was the Milestone Ground site, and the flood alleviation site is right at the bottom. You can see that series of conjoined rectilinear enclosures. That was the flood alleviation site that we also excavated back in 2016, 2017. And here is a really lovely image, I think, which was taken back in 2005, which shows just how well the site at Milestone Ground showed up as crop marks. So as you can see, a really quite complex series of enclosures, all imposed over the top of one another. Now, the site itself actually has a really unusual background for an archaeological site. Usually, as commercial archaeologists, we will roll up into a field, not much is known about it, we'll conduct trial trenching, see what's there, and then maybe later come back for some archaeological mitigation. But in this instance, the site itself has actually been known about for close to 100 years. Sadly, the nature reserve, which is located to the west of the site, and the football club to the east, these were quarried back in the early 20th century. But fortunately for us, there was a pioneering female archaeologist at the time called Nancy Smith who noticed what was going on and could see these colour changes in the soil in the quarry face, and stepped in to do some rescue archaeological works. And what she found was really quite amazing, given what she had to hand at the time. And she identified some really quite large Romano-British ditches. She had some burials. There's a really lovely image you can see in the top left corner there of some people gathered round a burial. And actually, I should warn you, there are images of human remains in this presentation. As well as that, they had a lot of evidence for Roman occupation. You can see the pottery in the top corner. There's some brooches in the bottom corner. But really interestingly, she also found evidence of prehistoric activity. So there was some Neolithic pottery recovered. There was some Bronze Age urns, and also the first decorated sherd of Anglo-Saxon pottery recovered from the county. That was found at Milestone Ground. So yeah, a really quite interesting background to the site. And thankfully, she did what she did, and we were able to know a little bit more going into our works, which, as I mentioned, started in June 2024. And we were commissioned to come and excavate the site, and we began stripping the site with machines. As you can see in front of you, we stripped the site down to the natural geology, which is something we refer to as the archaeological horizon, because this is where we can see the archaeology that's cut through the natural geology. It's backfilled with a different material, and then that's how we see it, as you can see from this drone shot. We knew from the crop marks and a bit of evaluation we did in 2014 that the site was really quite extensive and there was going to be a lot there. We didn't actually anticipate how much ended up being there, with the crop marks probably showing only around 30 to 50% of the features. And it was a bit like, in the end, it was a bit like playing archaeology bingo, because we were just ticking off every period. And yeah, basically the site itself dates from the Mesolithic right the way through to the Anglo-Saxon period. So it was incredible. And it's probably the worst kept secret. We've also got the largest Romano-British cemetery discovered in the county. So we've been on site for a year. I always like including pictures like this because, yes, we do work through all conditions. Fortunately, we're able to utilise technology to help us in understanding the site. So this is an orthomosaic image which we take by stitching loads of drone shots of the site together. And that gives us a really, really detailed sort of bird's eye view of the site. So you can see just how dense it is with archaeology here. As I mentioned, we stripped down to the natural geology. That shows up as this yellow. It's the Cotswold limestone gravel. You can see it as yellow on this site plan. The linear features you can see cutting across the site, northeast to southwest. These are the remains of ridge and furrow. So this is medieval agriculture, which is over the top of the archaeology, which is, quite unhelpful at times. It masks a lot of it, confuses it. So we produce our own survey of the site, which we can then remove the ridge and furrow, which, as you can see, has simplified it. And makes it much, much easier to understand, right? No. I really like this image because the contrast of all the archaeological features in black shows just how dense this site was, how much activity was going on. You can see there's a series of pink blobs and layers on here as well. Well, I've included these because these are natural features or layers. Things like tree throws or hollows or alluvial layers deriving from the Bunches Brook located just to the south of the site. These are actually quite important because this material itself derives from the brook. But what's interesting about it, it contains a host of Mesolithic material. So the first evidence we have for human activity on the site dates to the Mesolithic period. And this is a period where we're hunter-gatherers, we're living a nomadic lifestyle, we're moving through the landscape, often chasing, large game, natural resources, as they also move through the landscape seasonally. And the evidence we have of this is a whole series of very, very tiny flints called microliths. And this is the sort of technology that's being used during the Mesolithic period. Now, I know those of you who came to see Robin's talk have seen this image before. Now, these are a selection of the microliths that we recovered from our work at the flood alleviation site. We haven't, as of yet, done any analysis on the flints or any of the finds that we've recovered from Milestone Ground because we have literally just come off site. So that will be taking place over the next couple of years. So I will be referring to the flood alleviation site quite a lot because they are connected, especially when it comes to the Mesolithic material. So this wasn't an unexpected find because of our previous work. But it's really, really important to stress just how rare Mesolithic archaeology is. Elsewhere in the county, we don't really see it. We've had a few little bits, but just in my time, Offanem near Evesham, there's been a few little bits discovered around Kidderminster. But the quantity that we're getting from Broadway suggests that this was a really, really important landscape during the Mesolithic period. Now, from the flood alleviation site, we recovered around 3,800 microliths, and I'm expecting probably something similar from Milestone Ground as well. This material was often recovered from later layers. It was residual in later layers, so like the topsoil, the subsoil, maybe later Roman features. but it was also included in those natural features that you can see in pink on here. Now, we believe they may be not in situ, but had been washed into these natural hollows and depressions when the brook flooded. So we think a lot of this activity is taking place along the brook. And what's really interesting about the Mesolithic flint assemblage is that our analysis of it from the flood alleviation site showed that there was a predominance of hunting blades. And we weren't seeing much in the way of scrapers or plant processing tools. So we think the Mesolithic people that are operating in this landscape are probably chasing large game or even fishing along the brook. And that was actually supported by the animal bone, which we recovered from the flood alleviation site as well, which dated to this phase. And from that site, we recovered a lot of wild game, things like roe deer, red deer. We had wild pig. And interestingly, we also had aurochs as well, which is the ancestor to our cattle. They were much, much bigger, they were wild, and they were hunted. We actually got a radiocarbon date on one of the aurochs' teeth, and this came back as around 5,200 to 5,000 BC, placing this activity in the later Mesolithic. And this was actually supported by the flint assemblage as well, which had a focus on narrow blade technology, with broad blade technology being sort of more associated with the earlier and middle Mesolithic. So it's going to be really exciting moving forward to compare the two sites, but I am anticipating that we're going to be seeing something very similar at Milestone Ground as well. And so, yeah, just to stress, this is rare, and Broadway really does seem to be a hotspot for this activity. So following our Mesolithic activity on site, we also had middle to later Neolithic activity. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, also incredibly rare, but apparently not for Broadway. What I've done is highlight in red on this plan where we were seeing this Neolithic activity on site. And you can see there's a cluster of it in the north, slightly closer to Station Road, although this could be preservation bias, just due to the amount of Roman activity we're seeing in the centre of site that's probably destroyed a lot of this earlier Neolithic evidence. And here's a nice little reconstruction of a Neolithic scene. I think this was commissioned for Clifton Quarry on the River Severn. And so you can see people at work with axes and, yeah, pottery that apparently is correct. But our activity was basically represented by a series of pits, bowl-shaped pits, which is basically the predominant feature that we find dating to the Neolithic period. Evidence for structural features is really hard to come by. It's quite ephemeral. But what we do get are what are probably pits which have probably been used as refuse pits. And in total, we had, I think, just over 30 of these across the site. And what was really remarkable about these pits is just what they were filled with. The assemblage that we recovered from these Neolithic features was incredible. And already, I'm told, is the best Neolithic assemblage recovered from the county and is basically comparable to that which is being seen in Wiltshire as well. So really, really quite important. Here is a selection of the pottery which we recovered from the pits. It's really, really lovely. You just do not come across Neolithic pottery very often. I'm trying to think elsewhere in the county. We've had a few little Neolithic pits at Clifton Quarry. We had a couple at the flood alleviation site, but we weren't getting ceramic assemblages like this. Often we just get flint assemblages, which we can sort of loosely date to a broad Neolithic period, whereas this pottery was incredible. Almost every pit contained pottery, again, extremely rare. But what was really interesting about it is we had two types of vessels within our Neolithic assemblage. So the four images you can see on the right-hand side of the screen This is what's called impressed ware, and this dates from the sort of middle Neolithic. And the two images you see on the left-hand side, top and bottom, this is grooved ware, and this dates from the later Neolithic. So this is going to be really interesting in trying to build a chronology of our Neolithic activity on site. Do we have two distinct phases? Do we have, maybe a middle Neolithic farmstead, a bit of a hiatus, and then a later Neolithic farmstead? Or are we in that transitional period where both pottery types are in use at the same time? Now, we know that there have been some sites in the past that have contained both, and we think there is a broad crossover period, maybe between 3,100 to 2,700 BC, where both types of vessel are in use. So that's going to be really interesting to tease out in post-ex analysis and just really try and define that phasing within our Neolithic activity. But as well as the ceramic evidence, we also had some really lovely flint assemblages. We had flint blades, we had scrapers, but quite incredibly, we also had carved bone tools, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here. These may have been used as pins, but we think the top implement might have been used for decorating pottery, which would indicate we also have production on site. I've never seen tools like this, apart from in the museum at Stonehenge. So really, really quite cool. We also had an antler pick. You can see in the middle at the top there, that's an antler which was recovered from one of the pits. You can't see it too well in this photo, but the point of the antler has actually been worked. And this has probably been used as a pick for digging, and could have actually even been used to dig some of the pits that we've been excavating all this time later. And another amazing find, which you can see John is quite chuffed with himself there about, came from a pit. This is a fragmented, polished stone axe head. It's been fragmented, probably from use, but it still has some of its outer polished surface remaining. And what's interesting about that is we think we've recovered fragments of that polished surface from separate pits. So it's going to be really interesting to see if they do fit together. And we've actually had two conjoining sherds of pottery from two separate pits 40 metres apart on the site. So at the minute, we're not sure if this is deliberate or we're looking at midden material that's gone into the pits. But really quite remarkable to have two adjoining sherds 40 metres apart. Another really interesting aspect about the Neolithic assemblage is the amount of animal bone we were recovering from the pits. Again, you don't tend to get good preservation dating this far back of bone, but the limestone gravel at Broadway means that our bone preservation on site is exceptional. So that's going to offer us so much opportunity to look into basically the economy of the Neolithic people that were living here. We know during the Neolithic that this is when we first get farming on this island. This is when people are starting to settle down. They're domesticating crops and animals. So it's going to be really interesting to see just what species we're getting in this bone assemblage, whether we're still getting, for example, wild game as well as domesticated species, or is it all domesticated? So that's going to be really interesting. And likewise for our environmental samples, our soil samples, we haven't started processing them yet, but again, we can start to pull out things like domesticated grain from those soil samples. Following our later Neolithic activity, we had early Bronze Age activity, funnily enough, and broken record time again. It was really important. We only had 3 features on site which could be dated to the early Bronze Age, but quite incredibly, these were all beaker burials. So the beaker period roughly lasts from around 2,400 to 1,800 BC. And it's during this time that we see a lot of migration from the continent. And with that, we see new technologies coming onto this island. We see the first metalworking, which, sort of brings us out of the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age. But we also see what we call beakers, which is a form of really well-made, highly decorated, ornate pottery vessels. And this period of activity is often characterised by beaker burials because they're used as grave goods in funerary practice. You can see an example of the first one we excavated here in the north of the site. You can see the beaker is located at the northern end of the pit. It's a very dinky vessel. Sadly, because the grave was so shallow, it had been truncated slightly, as had the skeletal remains of the neonate that had been buried in the pit. But you can just see the leg bones in that flex position just the other side of the beaker vessel. Fortunately, enough of the vessel survived for us to be able to reconstruct it, as you can see here. It's a really, really lovely vessel. There were no other grave goods deposited in this grave, and that's maybe because it was a child, but we're not too sure. But our second beaker burial, which was also a neonate, sadly that was even more truncated, and we only had the very base of the beaker vessel surviving. But we think they're broadly comparable. It's probably likely to be a similar sized, similarly decorated vessel. Our third beaker burial was an adult inhumation, which was located in the centre of the site. And here you can see that individual. They'd been placed, the grave was aligned broadly northwest to southeast. They'd been placed in the grave in a flexed or crouched position, which is typical of the time, typical of prehistory actually. Their head was positioned at the south end of the grave and a beaker vessel placed next to their head. Sadly, a Roman ditch had been dug through that area later and had truncated most of the skull and a lot of the vessel. But fortunately, a lot of the beaker had survived and the lower mandible had also survived, which leaves us the option of maybe conducting isotope analysis on the molars to find out, various things about this individual, what their diet may have been, where they even came from. Are they local? Were they raised locally? Or have they migrated from the continent? So that's going to be really fascinating to look at in the future. Due to the level of damage to this beaker, you see there's a close-up there, we weren't able to reconstruct this vessel physically, but our illustrator, Laura, was able to draw the full profile of the vessel. So enough of the vessel survived for us to be able to reconstruct it like this. And that's really useful because, it gives us the full profile. It gives us the shape, the profile of the vessel, which is a really good indicator to the date. And we think this might be maybe around sort of the middle to later beaker period based off of that. And also, it's a really good conservation process because, this pottery is fragile and when it doesn't like being pulled out of the ground, and when it does, it tries to basically become mud again. But yeah, to have 3 beaker burials on site really is quite remarkable. We don't have any evidence for any Bronze Age funerary monuments on the site. Basically everything within this area, apart from those Neolithic pits and the beakers, seems to be Roman within the centre of the site. There may have been a funerary monument of some sort, but ditches weren't dug around these burials. They might have been satellite burials, but we don't have any evidence for that. We just know there was a lot of truncation later. So, turns out Broadway is a bit of a hotspot for beaker activity as well. So now there have been 4 discovered within the parish of Broadway, and there I am looking a lot younger back in 2016, and I was fortunate enough to be able to excavate the beaker that we recovered from the flood alleviation site. Robin talked about this to you earlier in the year, but this was actually a really interesting beaker pit, as there was no human remains present within the grave. The entire assemblage is characteristic of a beaker burial, and indeed we've got the full toolkit with barbed and tanged arrowheads, we've got a flint fabricator, we've got flint knives, And we've even got an antler spatula, which is used for pressure flaking flint. So it is a toolkit, as well as our lovely beaker vessel at the top. Now this assemblage and this pit, the beaker itself, dates to the very inception of the beaker period, around 2400 BC. So we know that this activity is reaching Broadway really early during that migratory period. So it's going to be really fascinating again to compare the two sites. There haven't been many beakers discovered in Worcestershire at all. There was one recently at Aldington, near Evesham, but sort of coincidentally, it's on the same brook. So again, we think the brook is key here, and that Aldington beaker was on the same brook. Elsewhere, we've had a little bit of beaker activity around Breeden Hill. I think there were 2 excavated in the early 20th century from the top, but elsewhere we haven't got beaker burials in the rest of the county. So yeah, it speaks for itself really. Broadway, again, very significant. We didn't have any evidence for early Bronze Age or Middle Bronze Age occupation on site. Neither did we actually have any evidence for later Bronze Age occupation. But what we did have in the very north of the site was a really enigmatic landscape feature comprising this pit alignment of about 59 pits, which kind of snakes its way northeast-southwest across the site. And this was Area 1. This is what we first started opening back in June last year. And this was targeting that pit alignment. And you can see them there as the circles, sort of, as I say, snaking their way down the site. Sadly, it continued south into the nature reserves, has been lost. But, because we did actually extend this area earlier this year, just to see how far it continued. But we know it also continued north towards Station Road, so might survive underneath the road there. Now, pit alignments are they're quite an unusual feature. We don't see many of them, and indeed, this is only the second one that's been discovered in the county. What we do know about them is they're likely to be sort of landscape boundaries. They're markers within the landscape. And this is actually a nice reconstruction of how it may have looked. This was actually done for the only other pit alignment that was found in the county, and that was actually at Hindlip, just north of Worcester. So this is how we think they may have looked. And they're often very sterile, with not much in them, which would indicate that there's not a lot of occupation activity taking place nearby. They're probably marking zones of control or boundaries within the landscape. We were really fortunate, actually, that 3 of our pits did contain some pottery sherds. And we think this pottery is likely to date from the later Bronze Age, which is actually quite important because a lot of these pit alignments elsewhere in the county do date from the Iron Age. So we might be just pushing that chronology slightly further back into that later Bronze Age, early Iron Age transitional period, which is really fascinating. As I mentioned, we didn't actually have any later Bronze Age occupation on site or any settlement, but we did at the flood alleviation site, where we had a number of roundhouses, unenclosed roundhouses, which also dated from this later Bronze Age, early Iron Age transitional period. So it's tempting to think that maybe this is representing a zone of control, a boundary of some sort, with that settlement we identified on the south side of the brook. But it's likely that this probably would have continued south to the brook, as they're often associated with watercourses, with the vast majority in the West Midlands being in the Trent Valley, the Trent and Tame valleys. So moving on to the Iron Age, we didn't actually have any evidence for early or middle Iron Age activity on site, but we did have later Iron Age activity. And that's actually represented by all those black blobs you can see in the southwest of the site, all those circles there. And these, over 400 of them in total, were quite large Iron Age storage pits. Interestingly, actually, before we actually came onto the site, we knew they were there, not as many. I think we thought maybe there would be about half as many as actually turned up. But they did show up as crop marks as well. And we were anticipating that maybe there was going to be some Iron Age activity underneath these Roman enclosures. Maybe there's an Iron Age farmstead here first that's basically continued in use right the way through the Roman period. But we didn't actually have any evidence for that. Everything seemed to be Roman within that enclosure complex. So what it now seems like is maybe, because you can see everything seems to be following that northwest to southeast alignment, maybe they're actually following the brook. And that Romano-British enclosure, which comes later, maybe is following just pre-existing boundaries that are already there. Maybe there's a trackway underneath Charles Wickham Road, something like that. But yeah, that was an interesting development once we started. And here's a nice little aerial shot showing just how well the pits showed up in the south of the site when they're not being covered by furrows. And you can see they did vary in size quite a lot, with some of the largest ones being well over 1 metre deep. And these would have been used for storing grain. Here you can see one of my colleagues excavating one. He was small enough to get in, unlike me. And yeah, you see they did vary in size, but we know that they were used for storing grain, which might seem counterproductive. Why would you store grain under the ground? But the way they would work is you would expect the top layer of grain to germinate, they'd be sealed over, and then this would suck all the oxygen and moisture out of the pit, creating an anaerobic condition which would preserve the rest of the grain. Incidentally, a lot of these pits were quite sterile as well, which is another good indicator that there isn't much Iron Age occupation activity taking place in the immediate vicinity. So what we're probably looking at is a massive Iron Age granary. What we don't know, which obviously would indicate that there's a heavy focus on arable farming in this landscape during that period. What we don't know yet, though, is how long these pits were in use for. It could indicate, perhaps that there's a lot of intensive activity going on over a short period of time, or maybe it's a much longer period of time. It's less intensive, with maybe just a couple of pits being dug each year. We're not quite sure on that yet. So again, hopefully something we can tease out. Interestingly, some of these pits were also used as graves. We had 3 examples within our 2 clusters of pits where individuals had been buried in the pits. 2 of them had been buried in the tops of these storage pits, and 1 had actually been buried at the base. And this might indicate that these were used as sort of haphazardly, as kind of makeshift graves. And we anticipate that these burials are also going to date from the later Iron Age, the fact they're in these pits, but also they're in that very tightly crouched position. And Iron Age funerary practice is really quite unusual, and this is kind of just another testament to that fact. So following our later Iron Age activity on site, the Romans came and they completely changed the use of this site. They imposed a whole series of very, very large rectangular enclosures across the site, and then they reimposed them, and they reimposed them, and they reimposed them, probably for close to 400 years. Our sort of early spot dating on finds that we're getting is showing that these enclosures were probably constructed in the 1st century, likely sort of mid-1st century, very early Roman period. And we know they were continuously sort of re-excavated and remodeled right the way through, right up until like the late 4th century as well, which is really quite interesting. It shows there's a lot of longevity on this site. People wanted to be here. So as well as all of these series of rectangular enclosures we had in the centre of the site, we also had a rather interesting D-shaped enclosure located in the east, just behind the medical centre. And here's a nice aerial shot of the D-shaped enclosure. It's called a D-shaped enclosure because it kind of looks like a capital D, if you squint maybe. But this was a really, really interesting area of site. And again, when we first excavated it, I was anticipating that maybe when we were getting towards those basal fills of the ditches, we would maybe find some later Iron Age pottery that might indicate that this was constructed in the later Iron Age and continued in use throughout the 1st century AD. But we just didn't get it. The basal fills, they had a lot of sort of transitional wares, local wares that are in use in the later Iron Age, but also the early Roman period. But they were often accompanied with very firmly datable Roman finds. So we think this was actually constructed in the 1st century, again, very early, mid-1st century, and probably went out of use somewhere in the mid-2nd century. So it's quite an interesting feature. It was very, very large. The ditches were very deep. Those of you might remember when you came to see it on site. And you might just be able to make out a series of rectangular features in the centre of this enclosure. And we'll be revisiting those in a bit. So as I mentioned, the ditches on site were massive. They're some of the biggest ditches I've ever had to excavate on a site. Even some of our smaller ones would have been the main enclosure ditch on any of our other sites that we've excavated elsewhere in the county. So these would have been really formidable enclosures. As I mentioned, in places they're up to 2 meters deep. And what you have to think about is that the upcast material from excavating these enclosures would have been heaped up on the inside to create a bank. And so we're looking at maybe a 4-meter drop. So really quite formidable construction, and would have been very visible within the landscape, especially from the top of Broadway Hill. So there's maybe a status thing going on here. We're not quite sure. We don't know why they decided to dig them so deep. It could be defensive. That's an easy thing to maybe think. But it could be about status. It could be about, I have control over this many people, and therefore I can put this labour force to work, and I can build something like this. So it's going to be really interesting, as I say, get into future analysis, see if we can just tease any of this sort of stuff out. And I actually walked to the top of Broadway Hill whilst we were excavating this site, and you could see it then really nicely, because obviously we'd stripped all the topsoil to this yellow gravel. So you can imagine just how visible it would have been as earthworks within this landscape. We didn't have any evidence for structural features within the enclosures. That's not to say that there weren't buildings within there. We just didn't have any evidence of them. They might have been slightly more ephemeral. Or they were used primarily as stock enclosures, and maybe that's why they were so deep, was to keep cattle in. That is your wealth. That's what's important to you, and you're going to defend it. What we know about this sort of complex Roman farmstead that was on site is that they had a mixed economy. There was evidence for pastoral farming as well as arable, and we were getting a lot of animal bone. Again, the preservation was exceptional, and we were seeing things like a lot of livestock, things like cattle. You can see there's a cattle skull deposited in this pit. We were also getting a lot of sheep, we were getting pig, and we were also getting working animals. There were equid remains, so there were horses, donkeys, and also dogs as well. So that's going to be really interesting to get some work done on that. And as well, we also had 5 really lovely T-shaped corn dryers dotted across the site. And these are a really good indicator that we've got a lot of arable farming going on site as well. So these would be used to dry your cereal crop in preparation for storage. Unlike the later Iron Age, in the Roman period, we believe raised granaries are in use rather than storage pits below the ground. But the way these would have worked is you have a firing chamber. In this instance, that's located on the left-hand side. You have a flue down the middle, and then you have your T-shaped compartment at the end. You would light a fire, or you'd or you'd shovel burning material into the firing chamber. This would heat up the air, which would be funneled down the flue and to the T at the end. At the T, there would have been a raised platform on which the grain would have sat, and as the hot air came up through this platform, it would have dried the grain. So we had some really lovely examples of these across the site. Here's another example, which was located in the south. Slightly different, slightly wider T, but following a broadly similar design. What was actually really interesting about our dryers is that often they were constructed into the top of backfilled ditches. So this is actually really useful in helping us date this activity. And so we think these T-shaped dryers are likely to date from the later Roman period, probably in the 4th century. The large ditch you can see that we've excavated a slot through there, this we think is likely to date from the Middle Roman period and has completely been silted up, backfilled, by the time this T-shaped dryer has been constructed. Now we think they're deliberately targeting these ditches as locations to construct these features, probably because it's nice soft ground, it's been dug out before, it's easy digging, but also probably because these are designed to exist below ground, which is why we have such good preservation. They're not positive features, they don't extend up, they're dug into the ground, which is why, as I say, they've survived. So it helps if you've already got a slight hollow in the landscape, and it's very practical. It's lazy, really. So we had a lot of nice finds from the Roman period. The Romans loved their stuff, and they had lots of it, and we just kept on bagging it up. So we had a lot of pottery, like the examples you can see on the screen in front of you. On the left-hand side, that's a Malvernian ware jar. That's a local fabric, as the name suggests. It's produced around the Malverns. And on the bottom here, there's a Severn Valley ware tankard. Again, this is a local ware produced up and down the Severn Valley. Incidentally, these are really useful pottery types to date the site because really helpfully, tankards change their shape as you get through the Roman period. So in the early Roman period, tankards are very much upright. They're straight-walled vessels. And then as you get into the later Roman period, they become less well-made and they start to flare out considerably. So we believe this example here is likely to date from the 4th century. As well as these local fabrics, we also had evidence for trade, and we had imported wares, such as the potsherd that you can see in the top right. That's a fragment of Samian ware. Now, that's a high-status tableware. This is likely to be the base of a bowl or a dish. This is manufactured in Gaul and is imported to Britain. This fragment is actually incredibly useful because it has the potter's stamp on the base. And you can't make it out on this screen, but it's his name, and it says Betunius. And we've been able to track Betunius and his kilns to what was then Eastern Gaul and is now southern Germany, just south of Nuremberg. And this would have been a frontier post. And it's a town called Perfunds in southern Germany, and there was a Roman fort there, and Betunius set up his kilns there and imported his Samian ware all across the empire, some of which found its way to Broadway. And then we dug it up and bagged it. So as well as pottery, we also had some really, really nice metalwork from the site. The image you can see on the left-hand side of the screen is really quite unusual, quite remarkable, and I've never really dug up a Roman face before. So to see that looking back at you was incredible. We think it's a mount of some sort. It's copper alloy. It could be a pot mount, but it could also maybe have been attached to an item of clothing, maybe a saddle. We don't know who it's depicting. Often, and there have been lots of examples, if you look on the Portable Antiquities scheme, of pot mounts, again, copper alloy, but they almost uniformly depict the face of Bacchus, because they would have gone on wine jugs. Whereas we're not sure about this one, but it could be the goddess Sibyl, which is a cult from Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, that apparently did make its way to Britain. And we think this because Sibyl often has a similar hairstyle and is depicted as having a castle in her hair. And we think that the top bit might be that castle in the hair. So again, really interesting. The coin you see at the top, that's a silver Tiberius. It's a tribute penny that's mentioned in the Bible. Really, really interesting find, especially because it's pre-conquest. It dates before the Roman invasion. So that could indicate that maybe it's still in circulation when, the Roman people are living and trading here, which is probably more likely, but there's a slim chance it could reflect some level of trade pre-conquest, although that's probably slightly less likely. There's a lovely glass bead at the top there that was found from a ditch near to the D-shaped enclosure. That tends to be 1st, 2nd century in date. And there's a really lovely Asica brooch at the bottom there. These are quite rare as brooches, and again, it dates from the 1st, 2nd century. It's really quite a lovely example. We also found this little beauty, which is a Roman seal box lid. Again, I've never seen one before. You can see it's enamelled. We've managed to clean it up really well. And this would have been used, basically, there would have been a back to it, and it would have been used to seal Roman wax writing tablets. So this is quite a high status find, and they have been used as evidence elsewhere, basically for the spread of literacy within this island. So again, that's a really, really interesting find, especially from what is pretty much a rural farmstead. It's an indicator that maybe there's a little bit of high status going on. If not on our site, it's very close by. And here's a lot of photos of my hands with various different finds. You can see this kind of shows how they come out of the ground, which is quite nice. I love the find in the top left corner. That is an ear scoop. So it's used for cleaning earwax out of your ears. So there's a bit of Roman hygiene there. So I'm not sure we'll do residue analysis on that, but you never know. We've also got a few more brooches. There's an annular brooch up there. There's a trumpet brooch. Again, tends to be 1st, 2nd century. In the middle there, that coin, that's a Trajan sestertius. A couple of coins down here. Again, another silver Tiberius tribute penny. And there's a late Roman Constantine there. And this little find in the corner, really interesting. It's a sword chape, which is basically the little copper alloy fitting that would go at the end of your scabbard to stop your sword from poking all the way through. There would have been a backing to it. So it's a really, really nice find, especially as I'm sure you're aware of those 2 Roman cavalry swords that were discovered at Willersey nearby. It's probably the most interesting Roman element that we had on site was the cemetery that was located in the D-shaped enclosure. This was completely unexpected. I think our costings initially had been for around 10 burials on site, and in total we had 129, which took up most of our time last summer when we first stripped the site. Now, 3 of those burials were obviously Beaker period, 3 were later Iron Age, with all the rest being Roman. 79 of them were confined to the cemetery, or were located in the cemetery around the D-shaped enclosure. So on this image here, again, you've got the archaeological features in black, apart from the graves, which are showing in red. Now, this was just an amazing find. As I said, we had 79 in total from the cemetery. It's the largest Roman cemetery ever discovered in the county, probably also the wider region. There was a large cemetery discovered at Wasperton on the River Avon, but a lot of that seemed to date from the 5th century and the Anglo-Saxon period. There have been large cemeteries from Gloucestershire around, but these are more like urban cemeteries attached to Kingsholm, Gloucester and Cirencester. So this is a really, really important discovery. You can see there's some clear zoning going on within the cemetery as well. There's a row of 4 graves at the bottom. There's a cluster on the western edge, and then there seems to be a long line of them, all sort of broadly aligned northwest to southeast, coming down that eastern edge of the D-shaped enclosure, but really interestingly, also continuing past it, which might suggest that there was another boundary to this cemetery. And whilst they wanted it to be on top of this D-shaped enclosure, there was maybe the ditch on the outside, which is actually the boundary of the cemetery. We had a whole variety of different types of burial in here. Several had been buried in coffins, and we had the remains of the coffin furniture surviving. These were nails. Sometimes you could even see a coffin stain in the backfill of the grave. We also had some which had stone lining, as you can see in the example at the top. And interestingly, we also had a couple of intercutting graves, where graves had been dug later and truncated the earlier one next to it. Now this is really, really common in medieval and later cemeteries, all focused in a churchyard where it's sort of really sort of intense, dense burial activity. But you don't tend to see it in a Roman cemetery outside of urban contexts. So that might indicate that the cemetery was quite long-lived, or maybe that grave markers hadn't been present or had been lost subsequently. We know that this cemetery dates from the later Roman period. It's likely to be 4th century in date. We'd already established that the D-shaped enclosure has probably gone out of use by the mid-2nd century, and we had a whole series of graves which were truncated into the top of that enclosure, as this image shows. We've also been able to recover 2 radiocarbon dates, 2 early sort of range finders, which have given a rather broad date of later 3rd to very early 5th. But we do think this is likely to be 4th century in date based on a number of the grave goods that we've recovered from some of the graves. Some examples on the screen now. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see that individual had been buried with copper alloy bracelets around the arm. The top right, one individual had been buried with 86 very tiny glass blue beads. These, incidentally, were all found around the pelvis, which would indicate they were on an item of clothing. And early analysis of the beads suggests that some of them, which weren't blue, had been coated in gold leaf. So again, really, really interesting. Some burials, some individuals had been buried wearing hobnail boots. You can see, you can just about make out this photo here of the feet. There's some little iron, a row of iron going underneath each foot. These are hobnails. These are very sort of archetypal Roman footwear. We also had 2 burials with really, really nice, highly decorated bone combs, as you can see in the bottom corner there. We think that, we know bone combs are a later Roman artifact, but we think they don't start appearing until around the 360s AD. And they've been used as evidence to suggest there's a more sort of northwestern, northern European culture coming across into Roman Britain, which is really quite interesting and precedes that sort of Anglo-Saxon migration. Another really interesting aspect to the cemetery was a number of what we call alternative burials. And this includes decapitations, as you can see on the screen here, as well as prone burials, where the individuals had been buried lying face down. Now, it's very easy to think that maybe this could have been the cause of death, or maybe it's a punishment of some sort. But elsewhere in the country, and by the way, decapitations is broadly a phenomenon that is just limited to this island within the Roman Empire. So it's maybe a continuation of some funny Iron Age practices. But there has been evidence from elsewhere that the decapitation process was done post-mortem, after the individual had already died, and it was done very surgically and deliberately, with sometimes the skull being buried by the feet or on the lap. Sometimes it wasn't even deposited in the grave at all. And we know the grave hadn't been truncated, so we know it was a deliberate decision not to bury the skull. We're not quite sure why they do it, basically, but there have been a few suggestions that maybe it's aiding passage into the afterlife, or it's stopping them from rising again. And so, yeah, it could be, it's been talked about maybe fear of ghosts, things like that. But it's a very strange and unusual burial practice, but we do see it on a lot of rural sites, and about 10% of those burials are what we would class as alternative. What's interesting about Broadway is from the cemetery, we had about 20 in total that were alternative, which is about 20% of our cemetery. And as you can see here, there's some examples of individuals who'd been buried lying face down, and the individual on the bottom left-hand corner also looks like they'd had their hands tied. This burial that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a comb that's been buried where the skull should be. There was no truncation to this grave. The skull had not been deposited in the grave, but where it should have been, a bone comb had been placed. So this is very deliberate, and it's really, really quite interesting. So the cemetery as a whole is offering us a fantastic opportunity to actually try and learn about and understand the Roman people who were born here, who lived here, worked here, and died here during that later Roman period. And what's really exciting about this is we've managed to get the Milestone Ground Cemetery included in a joint research project by the universities of Cardiff and York, and they're going to be undertaking a whole host of analysis for us, for their own project, but we're lucky we get to tag along. And they're going to be looking at things like ancient DNA. They're going to look at the DNA of these individuals, and they're going to be undertaking isotope analysis as well. So from that DNA work, we're going to be able to establish whether we've got family groups within this cemetery. We're hopefully going to be able to see those connections, and maybe we'll be able to tease out whether we have zoning of these connections as well. With the isotope work, we're going to be able to see what their diet was like, and we're going to be able to see whether they're local. Are these people, or are some of these people, from elsewhere in the empire? Have they been brought over to this island? Did they migrate to this island? Were they raised elsewhere in this country? Or are they local people? So that's going to be really, really exciting to do all of this work over the coming years. And I'm hoping that we're going to get some really, really good results on that. So if that wasn't enough, we also had Anglo-Saxon archaeology, which I've highlighted in yellow on the plan here. And this was characterised largely by the remains of Anglo-Saxon buildings. This could have been post-built structures, like rectangular post arrangements like you can see in the north, but also a type of feature that we call sunken featured building. And these look like large, shallow, often shallow, sort of oval pits in the ground, often filled with a dark material. And here's my colleague Ryan doing his best to look like an Anglo-Saxon man with his hair, placing a scale on one of these SFBs that's been quadranted. And you can see we've got a post hole at either end. You can just about make out those two holes. There would have been two central post holes keeping this structure up. The floor is deliberately sunken, and we think these are probably used as workshops. My colleague Abby is working on some reconstructions at the minute, so she kindly let me use this. It's not finished, but we can see a classic large Anglo-Saxon hall up there, but also what we think these, what we call them, we abbreviate them to SFBs, sunken floored buildings, what they might have looked like. With, like I say, you'd step down into this sunken floor and you'd have had a crude sort of cover over the top of you. we think they're used as workshops rather than sort of anything more domestic. And that's because of the finds that we often get associated with them. And these finds are often reflective of textile working. So you can see the examples on the screen here. The top left corner, we've got a stack of donut-shaped loom weights, which has fallen over they were actually within the SFB that I've just shown you the photo of. These would have been used on the loom to pull the textile, the string, taut whilst it was weaved. We've also got a spindle whorl on the top right corner, and from 2 of our SFBs, by the way, we had about 7 in total across the site, as well as 3 or 4 post-built structures. We had 2 bone combs deposited in these. We're not sure yet whether these are textile working combs or therefore hygiene, but they're going to make a really fascinating comparison to those later Roman combs that we know are likely to be 4th century, and see whether we have got much continuity, whether activity on site continued throughout the end of the Roman period right the way through, or whether we've got a bit of a hiatus. But these are some really, really lovely finds. Another really interesting one, you might have noticed the coin in the centre at the top. That is a coin of Constantine. It's early 4th century, it's late Roman, but really interestingly, it's had a hole drilled through it, and that's because it's likely been worn as a piece of jewellery, either as an earring or a pendant. And this we see is really common factor. It's a really common characteristic of Anglo-Saxon occupation on site. Coinage has gone out of use during that early medieval period, or that early sort of migratory period, and Roman coins are being used as jewellery, which is really nice. And we had 2 of those. Here's an example of some of the remains of the post-built structures that we had on site. This is on the corner by the football pitches, and you can see here, basically we've got post holes in a broadly rectangular arrangement. These are more likely to be the buildings where people are living. And this particular example was located just north of an SFB. So maybe they're contemporary. We didn't have any dating evidence from these post holes, but we know based on the typology that these are more likely to be early medieval in date. We had something very similar from the flood alleviation site. I think we had 4 or 5 buildings like this, and one of which was C14 dated to, I think it was the 7th century. So again, that sort of middle Anglo-Saxon period. So a really, really, again, stress the point, it is rare, and it's a really, really lovely element to have on Milestone Ground as well. We don't get much Saxon archaeology across the county. It really is quite ephemeral, and often it's been lost to medieval agriculture. So yeah, thank you very much. That was my bringing you up to date on our work at Milestone Ground. And yeah, thank you very much. It leaves me just to say that we will be back here in a couple of weeks at the Lifford Centre on Friday the 31st of October between 2 and 6 with my colleague Constance here, and we'll be doing an open day where you can come and see some of the artefacts that we found on site and ask any more questions if you'd like to. So thank you very much.
We've time for 1 or 2 questions.
Hopefully this will be a question that might be of interest to other people. But the grain dryers,
Yes.
what happens to something like that before any building work starts? Because I can imagine most of the other artefacts can be taken away and preserved, but something like that, I guess it can't.
No. So, I mean, archaeological excavation, by its nature, is destructive. We are destroying it as we excavate it. We learn what we can about it, we take it right back, and then often we actually deconstruct the structure as well to its original construction cut. So often we will remove a lot of that stonework as well to see how it was built. But fortunately, we have some really good technology now, and we would often do 3D models of these corn dryers. So we'd fly the drone over it, and we're able to produce really highly detailed 3D models of the dryers. But no, for the most part, they remain on site and have been backfilled.
So
They're still there underneath the soil again, yeah.
Hi. When Robin was here earlier in the year, he said that there were indications there might have been a high-status building like a villa or something, and if there was, it was probably under one of the quarries. Yeah. Is that still your thought, or is that just a wild idea by Robin?
I'm convinced that somewhere in Broadway there's a villa. I think maybe by the later period, it's easy to think that our farmstead could be attached to a larger villa estate. Villas sort of spring up in the later Roman period. It takes a long time for us on this island to become fully Romanised, and ironically that kind of happens just as the Roman Empire decides to leave us alone. And we had a smattering of high status goods across the site, and we know there's from work at Charles Wickham, we had a stone structure there which we think is Roman. We don't know if it was a villa. It was done 25 years ago in a pipeline, Severn Trent pipeline that came across it. So we didn't get to see it properly. But I'm convinced that somewhere in this landscape there is a Roman villa. Yeah. I don't think we have enough evidence to suggest it was within one of the quarries. We didn't have a huge amount of building material on site. We did have some tegula, which is ceramic Roman roof tile, but there wasn't a huge amount. But it's still interesting to think how that tegula made it onto our site.
Well, Jamie, thank you very, very much on behalf of the Broadway Museum and the History Society for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Jamie, very, very much.
You're welcome.